Remember this tweet by Mark Hamill?
All around me are familiar faces, worn out places, worn out...
Yeah, I feel that one, Hamill. Disney obviously wasn't going to do justice to the original heroes, so instead, throw away your movie tickets and Disney Plus subscription and go to the bookstore and go grab Heir to the Empire. I promise you won't be disappointed, Mark. As we all by know, the sequel trilogy is a bomb, for many reasons I expressed in other videos. Now, I have to apologize for my frustration with sequel fans recently. I got so angry with them because they don't budge when confronted with irrefutable evidence. I'm thinking of unlisting my sequel fans are not true Star Wars fans video because I was so fed up with stubborn sequel fans who don't listen or properly respond to my points. The idea behind that video was to draw sequel fans in and bash them over the head with the evidence that they continue to ignore even after that. I think maybe love is a better way to get them to change their ways than force. So sequel fans, if you're watching this, you may think the sequel trilogy is the definitive version of what happened after Return of the Jedi, but as many of you have expressed, they are your only exposure to the post-Return of the Jedi era. I heavily implore you to go read the Thrawn Trilogy. It's often referred to as the original sequel trilogy, and for good reason. Quality stories are being overlooked because they're not as accessible. If you don't like reading, then I implore you to listen to the audiobook, the 20th anniversary edition narrated by Mark Thompson. The narrator is very expressive and does its best to present itself like a new Star Wars movie. So if reading is the problem, there's your alternative. There's also a comic book adaptation to my knowledge that visualizes everything. Seriously, here's my challenge for you. Go read or listen to Heir to the Empire and the rest of the Thrawn Trilogy, and then come back and tell me why the Disney movies aren't soulless cash grabs. Practically every criticism people had about the sequels are non-existent with my experience with Heir to the Empire alone. Plot holes? Non-existent. Butchering the original characters? Non-existent. Copy-paste plots? Non-existent. I sometimes wonder why the hell the authors of the expanded universe weren't the filmmakers, and why J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson instead were given the keys to the franchise. In my usual rant mode, I'd complain that sequel fans don't give the expanded universe a chance because they live under the delusion that it was never canon, citing quotes from George Lucas without realizing that the same applies to the sequels if you use George Lucas to define canonicity. Given I've previously discussed George Lucas's actual role in the expanded universe, I'm going to explain why this novel specifically and the prequel trilogy actually reinforce each other in the overall continuity. Heir to the Empire, published in 1991, written by Timothy Zahn, who is best for, well, mostly Star Wars books. He is best known as the creator of Thrawn, one of the most popular non-film characters in Star Wars. But those who know about him probably haven't read the original 3 stories he appeared in. They just hear about this calm, collected, alien exception of the Empire and make their judgment based on second-hand accounts. That's highly understandable, but if you can, Heir to the Empire wasn't designed to be the mainstream next chapter to the original saga. I see it more like the main stories post-Return of the Jedi combined are the sequel trilogy of the expanded universe. Unlike the actual sequel trilogy, Heir to the Empire continues the story of the characters without murdering them all off to spring up the shitty new. The new characters are on the same foot as the old ones, which is what I wish the sequels tried to do. And if the sequel trilogy has the balls to kill any of the legends off, it better earn it. Heir to the Empire, being the second Legends novel I completed, if I had to compare this to Darth Plagueis, I think Heir to the Empire is the better novel. I have to give Darth Plagueis some slack. It was written in an age where continuity was lax in the expanded universe, and it gave great perspective into the Sith ideology, but it seemed less focused and less engaging than Heir to the Empire. Also, the novel was highly inconsistent and or questionable with the films and the rest of the expanded universe to a degree. Heir to the Empire is a more focused, interesting, and consistent adventure to the original films, and even the prequel trilogy. Yeah, I said it. You might be asking 20 questions right now, especially if you haven't read the book. Don't worry, we'll talk about it later. This novel is sort of the feeling you'd get if a sequel trilogy was made in the 90s instead of a prequel trilogy. This novel had a huge impact on Star Wars, establishing a lot of staples of the expanded universe and even the films. Our novel starts 5 years after Return of the Jedi with the perspective of a new character, Gilad Pellaeon, a captain in the Imperial Navy. Thinking about how the story was structured, this was probably the best way to start the story. Return of the Jedi ended with a happily ever after with the Empire's defeat. So does this novel undo Return of the Jedi? Heir to the Empire makes it clear that the Empire was defeated at Endor, but they are still strong and still fighting. This is a huge contrast to the Disney Galactic Empire, where they decided to bomb loyal, resource-rich worlds instead of the rebellions, and it backfired spectacularly, and the Empire surrendered within a year after the Battle of Endor. Well, I'm thankful to say that the Lucas-era Galactic Empire is nowhere near cognitively incapable as the Disney one. The Empire, while weakened, is still tough and is still giving the rebels a hard time, because they're not giving up so easily. Gilad Pellaeon is an old, gruff-sounding Imperial. His role can essentially be described as the right-hand man / sidekick to Grand Admiral Thrawn. Most of his character comes from his interactions with Thrawn, and the two play off of each other for characterization. I love how well they establish new things into the overall story. Take Rook for example. Before Star Wars Rebels absolutely butchered his design,
looks like a bucket of diarrhea!
Rook and the Nogri are cold, lizardy henchmen for Grand Admiral Thrawn. We're introduced to Thrawn through a moderate amount of build-up. The novel describes the cold, calm, and collected nature of Thrawn. Thrawn really comes across as someone who's adapted the flaws of those like Palpatine, Vader, and Tarkin, and showing all the effective ruthlessness nonetheless. Scratch that, it feels like he never had any of the flaws. Thrawn's design, while simple, is effective. You see, a minor issue with Thrawn in Disney canon is giving him pupils. It's shown many times in Heir to the Empire that Thrawn can intimidate because of his blank red eyes, which thankfully the Pop Funko based on Star Wars Rebels got dead right. We're given the impression that Thrawn stares into people's souls because of the lack of pupils. Thrawn was essentially a character we're supposed to be highly impressed by. The novel elaborates on how Thrawn was the only non-human to attain the rank of Grand Admiral, although I have heard there was this one alien that was able to pass off as a human and become a Grand Admiral, but that was a different story. Thrawn is an interesting character right off the bat. In another external material, we learn that he is part of the Chiss species, a race of near-humans who mature really quickly and are overly level-headed, and it takes very specific circumstances to actually frustrate one. You might be asking, with all this working to the Empire's advantage, where the hell was Thrawn during the original trilogy? And that's another great thing. The novel explains at the same time that Thrawn was not a mainstream Imperial Grand Admiral. He was mostly out in the unknown regions, gathering systems for the Empire. We're also told that Palpatine personally appointed Thrawn to his position, and was probably one of the few Palpatine respected in the entire galaxy besides himself. Speaking of, this novel does something the sequels don't: world building. We learn more about Imperial rule during the Dark Times. The story basically confirms that the Empire was highly xenophobic towards aliens, and mostly humans and near-humans were the only ones allowed to serve in the Imperial Navy and Army. It's probably why Thrawn was an exception. It was because he is what we'd classify as a near-human, so he'd have a better chance than Pizza the Hutt. Anyways, with that being said, just like any other oppressive government, the laws against aliens are more nuanced. The Empire generally hates non-humans, but if they prove themselves worthy or talented enough, or if they are close enough to a human, they can gain positions through hard work. Although most didn't, because why would you serve a government that actively looks down on you? While it isn't specifically elaborated on why Thrawn joined the Empire instead of the Equal Rights for Aliens rebellion, it adds to the character's intrigue and something that can be expanded on another time. You see, the sequels didn't need to explain the specifics of absolutely everything, but world building would have gone a long way. Anyways, Grand Admiral Thrawn is also a tactical genius. He was always thinking ahead and staying level-headed throughout, thinking outside the box commonly. Oh, and did I also say this is all in the first chapter only? The second chapter, we're introduced to Luke Skywalker, and instead of tossing his father's lightsaber away, we see how he deserved to be portrayed, picking off from where we were left with. Even though he's triumphed over the dark side, redeemed his father, and defeated the Emperor, of course his journey is far from over. He was only 23 after all. Well, what is his new challenge to overcome? I'll give you a hint. It doesn't involve breaking his character, that's for one. Well, let me tell you what it is. It's Luke learning to let the Force guide him after Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, after becoming Force Ghosts for some time, decide to become one with the Force. Luke is unprepared for their decision and is startled when they say their final goodbyes. I mean, that's how you get the audience on their toes without fucking insulting them. It's up to Luke to pick up the pieces and rebuild the Jedi Order. I want to point out something. Luke's cameo in The Mandalorian is soulless when you think about it. That whole scene was clearly sprung up based on the character's pre-established recognition. It's actually fair to say that that scene from Battlefront 2 EA between Luke and Del was actually more fulfilling because it wasn't sprung up based on pre-established recognition. It was just a discussion between two characters about choosing your destiny. Heir to the Empire is basically that, except it's a more impressive story and Luke's time in the story is greatly extended. So anyways, I wanted to talk about Leia. Leia is pregnant with twins and not an incest child, and she's training to become a Jedi. Yeah, that's another thing. Leia went from not being a Jedi to suddenly being a Jedi in the sequel trilogy. I hope you, the viewer, if you are a sequel fan, can realize the issue. As a 3-part story, the sequels are terrible at being a 3-part story. None of them flow with each other, they all change things constantly, and that's a huge problem for story consistency. Anyways, the story sets up very clearly that Leia is also becoming a Jedi. Also, in Chapter 3, we're introduced to Han Solo and Chewbacca, and instead of undoing his arc, we of course pick up where we left him. He's about to become a father, and nowadays is sent out on tedious diplomatic missions. All 3 of the characters are faithfully written, and are a far cry from what we saw in the sequels. I'm really just comparing this to the sequels, because they were both trying to do the same thing, continue the story from Return of the Jedi. We learn that the New Republic, while outnumbering the Empire, is struggling to form alliances with worlds. Mon Mothma and Admiral Akbar are all minor characters in the story, but they are still representative of what we saw in Return of the Jedi. This is where I have to talk about the plot point where Thrawn forges an alliance with a Dark Jedi named Jorah Sabayoth. At first I thought, wait, this guy was an old Jedi from the Republic era? Why have I never heard of him? So I looked him up on Wikipedia, and damn does this guy have a lot of backstory. Turns out he went missing before the prequels, which is probably why I hadn't heard of him. While there is a bit of retrospective confusion on how the hell this guy ties into the prequel trilogy, it's not like a talented enough writer can't fill in the blanks, and I hope not. Given the Clone Wars is mentioned quite a bit here, I wanted to discuss how it's handled. So far in the Thrawn Trilogy, the prequels can very much coexist with the Thrawn Trilogy. While Timothy Zahn probably had a way different idea on what the Clone Wars was, the fact that he very sparingly mentioned past events with vagueness makes it easy to be read by an expanded universe newcomer. In fact, the 2 stories reinforce each other. The Imperial capital Coruscant appears in this story. You see, George Lucas, when drafting The Phantom Menace, was going to call it Had Abaddon, but then went on board with Heir to the Empire's name, which actively proves Lucas's story and the expanded universe coexisted equally with his vision. I would like a sequel fan to still try to explain to me why the expanded universe was never canon, even after learning this. That's your challenge. Sabayoth is an undershadowed character, given I've never heard of him, and I was so intrigued by him and his unknown backstory that I'm just dying to know more about him. Also, another part of the story are the Yislamari, lizards that somehow block the Force when in close enough range, and it isn't really explained how they do this, and it's something I have to criticize. It doesn't really make sense directly, it's something that you have to overlook, and it is sort of convenient when there's a hurdle like that, so it can challenge Luke Skywalker, for example. This brings us to Mara Jade and Talon Karrde. Mara Jade is an iconic character in the expanded universe, and when we're first introduced to her, she's an angry, bitter woman with the sole motivation being her hatred of Luke Skywalker. Given we probably know how Mara Jade ends up, it made me wonder how she'll go to hating his guts to marrying him. I did also want to talk about the idea that George Lucas hated the character. From what I've seen, this is a common expanded universe hater argument, and that one of the expanded universe authors has disputed this as a mere myth. So there is no definitive proof that George Lucas hated Mara Jade. So far, Mara Jade just seems like a hot-headed character. I have no specific thoughts on the character so far. I'm going to have to read more of the expanded universe to form an opinion on Mara Jade. There's also Talon Karrde. This guy is basically Mara Jade's smuggler boss, given she's running with those sorts of people after the fall of the Empire. According to Wikipedia, Karrde is supposed to be what Han Solo would be like if he didn't join the rebellion. Karrde is an interesting character, also someone I had never heard of up until that point, but from what I've seen, he's very prominent in post-Return of the Jedi stories. The structure of the story is a direct continuation of Return of the Jedi. Luke goes to Dagobah, going into the dark side cave and finding an artifact that was there from the very beginning, as well as a vision where a woman pushes him off the sail barge in Return of the Jedi. Everything ties together in this novel. Everything is reactive to each other and nothing is put on the sidelines when the plot needs it to. Multiple things go on at once. For example, when Thrawn sends Nogri to kidnap Leia during the trio's mission to recruit a world into the New Republic, the tension is constant and everything is utilized simultaneously. The trio went to a planet for diplomatic reasons, but Thrawn has sent assassins to kidnap Leia because he made a deal with Sabayoth to capture Luke and Leia so that he can train them. That's quite a mouthful, but it goes to show the complexity of the story. Also, the story absolutely does the why over the what. For example, why does Mara Jade hate Luke Skywalker? Because her job as an Emperor's hand was ruined and she couldn't join the Imperial Remnant because no one knew about her because she had a secret role in the Emperor's regime, so the Imperial Remnant Command probably wouldn't accept her. My favorite part of the book, and when shit really hits the fan, where after the heroes split up, Luke, after escaping from Thrawn, gets scooped up by a smuggler's ship commanded by Talon Karrde. This is where we first meet Mara Jade with Luke, and Luke, because of Yuslamari, gets stunned and knocked out. He is then held prisoner by the smugglers. Meanwhile, Han and Lando try to hire them for slicing, unaware that they hold Luke prisoner. On top of this, Thrawn shows up to request more Yuslamari from them, and Talon Karrde has to juggle people around and not get caught by any side. This is probably why Heir to the Empire is so effective. As I said, it's complex and it's reactive to the actions of everyone. I also like how the characters are outside the box thinkers. Thrawn usually looks deeper than his right hand Captain Pellaeon, and Pellaeon plays off of Thrawn by observing how clever Thrawn is. There's a sequence where Luke is locked in a cargo room. Mara Jade locks him in there and fries the lock, but Luke actually uses his artificial hand, the one he got at the end of Empire Strikes Back, as the hand has a power coupling that he uses to open the damn door. Mara Jade eventually catches him, and they're forced to work together in the middle of the wild environment. That's great writing if I've ever seen it. The story is structured like a part 1, as it ends on a cliffhanger. Leia has an attempt on her life by the Nogri, but after killing one, the other Nogri stops after smelling her, recognizes she has the scent of Darth Vader because they're related, and stops in his tracks. Leia talks to him about how the Empire tricked them when the Nogri's homeworld was devastated during the Clone Wars, and they continued to poison their homeworld even after it was destroyed. At the end of the story, Thrawn attacks a shipyard, and the rebels barely avert his attack. We're left with a lot of things to think about before the next book comes out, but unlike The Force Awakens, it's how the story will progress and not stuff that should have been explained in the movie. Like how Admiral Ackbar is accused of being a traitor. That's saved for the next book. So basically, the story focuses on continuing the war between the rebels and the Empire because the Empire aren't idiots and refuse to give up so easily. That's the wider plot, but just like a lot of well-written novels, there are a lot of setups that I hope will get satisfying payoffs. What will happen to Admiral Ackbar? How will Sabayoth seduce Luke to the dark side? What tricks does Thrawn have up his sleeves? And so on. The cliffhanger was certainly well earned, almost as much as Republic Commando, and there were no major plot holes given to generate fan theories. Why couldn't the sequel trilogy be like this? As with every story, I have to find something to whinge about because, well, no story is perfect. First, I disliked how the ending was a bit slow. It felt too much like the climax was being saved for later. I still would have preferred a more standalone ending. Also, some of the characters seem to have little purpose in the story. There's this one part where Luke escapes from Thrawn. Thrawn pulls the villain kills his own men cliche on someone the story just made up to just have them die. And also, given Thrawn's calm and collected nature, he doesn't feel like the type to replicate Darth Vader's punishments for failure. But at least he kills them for a reason, and it's not like Moff Gideon, who disposes of his limited amount of stormtroopers like they're candy because he's too stupid for his own good and doesn't realize how much more valuable Imperial lives are. Still, I didn't like that. Also, this scene had him decide whose fault it was that Skywalker got away, and he makes that decision within 2 minutes presumptuously. Also, while the references were used sparingly and mostly used at appropriate times, some were very ham-fisted, like Han and Lando talking about winning the Falcon by playing Sabacc, and there's an overly long part where Han plays Sabacc with strangers that seem to have no insignificant bearing on the story. Maybe it'll come up in Dark Force Rising or The Last Command, but I wouldn't hold my breath for it. Also, another thing I didn't like is when the narrator for the audiobook was speaking for the Wookiee character, he wasn't very clear what the Wookiee was saying when translated to English, and I missed a lot of words. But overall, I love this novel. One description that stood out to me was when Luke was incapable of using the Force, and it felt like having all your senses cut off at once, which is consistent with how Karrde described it in KOTOR 2 when one loses their connection to the Force. I would recommend that someone make a special edition for this story, given this was made before the prequels. Given we all know with the prequels, it seems really unconnected for the prequels when they talk about it. Even though Timothy Zahn is quite vague with what he describes, but I think given the prequels exist, there should have been a version that explains things a little bit more. Like Sabayoth and why he wasn't in the prequels at all, despite being from that era, or what Thrawn and Pellaeon did specifically during the Clone Wars. What I'm saying is that given this novel was written before opened up knowledge on the Clone Wars, it might be nice to clarify some things and add some details. Otherwise, I fell in love with this novel and was upset that it ended, although there's 2 books ahead of me, so the story is far from over. I am further drawn into the expanded universe, and again, I implore you, the viewer, to give it a shot. I give Heir to the Empire a 9 out of 10. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?